So back when we were kids, I remember we'd go to visit our grandparents, and we'd go into their house, and right beside the door, at the entrance of their house, they had this place where my grandpa or whoever could come in and sit down, and it was kind of like this combination between a stool and this mirror and this big coat rack, hat rack. And so my grandpa would come in and would take off his shoes, and then he could wash up and go up into the house. And we'd come in, and we thought this thing was fascinating because it had a bunch of hooks on it, and it had all kinds of cool seed company hats, right? He'd come in, and that was where he'd hang his hats. And so it was this place, all these hooks, all these places that you could hang your hat, and sometimes maybe we'd hang one up there too when we'd come in. And I mentioned this place where my grandfather hung his hat, because there was a time when the Pharisees wanted to quiz Jesus, and they wanted to test him. And they got somebody from amongst their ranks, somebody who was a real ringer, the sharpest of the lot, and they said, listen, you know the scriptures backwards and forwards, forwards and backwards. You know the heart of it. Go to Jesus, ask him a question. That's your job. Ask him a really sharp question, something that's going to stump Jesus, and everybody's going to laugh and see he's a phony. And so this teacher of the law goes to Jesus and says, hey, Jesus, everybody knows that there's a lot of commandments in the scriptures. Which one is the greatest? Which one's the greatest commandment? And this is kind of a hard question if you think about it, because where do you start, right? I mean, there's the law and the prophets and the writings, and people have been treasuring these scriptures for thousands of years already, and so which part is the most important part? And he asks that to Jesus, and I kind of imagine Jesus pausing, and there's this dramatic moment, and then Jesus says, the most important commandment is this: love the Lord your God with all of your heart and all of your mind and all of your strength and all of your soul. And he says, not only that, but there's a second commandment, and it's this. It says, it follows on the first: love your neighbor as yourself. On those two commandments hang the law and the prophets. And that gets the conversation rolling. And we want to look at that this morning, this idea that it's the love of God and the love of neighbor on which the commandments hang, on which the whole of the scriptures find their meaning and their heart. Love God, love your neighbor. And this week we're doing a two-part series. So this week we're talking about the love of God. And next week we're talking about the love of neighbor, and the two of them fit together. And Jesus' answer, it's very simple but very profound. What we're called to do is to love God. And what I notice here, when Jesus talks about the most important commandment, what I notice is that Jesus doesn't turn to one of the negative commandments of the Old Testament. So he could have gone to the 10 Commandments, and he could have said, the most important commandment is to have no idols, to worship no God before the true God. Or he could have said the most important commandment is to not kill or to not commit adultery. But Jesus' most important commandment is positive. It's something that we're called to do. We're called to love God with heart, soul, and mind. And in the Gospel of Mark, we're going to see next week, the scripture adds strength. And so there it is, this positive commandment for what we're supposed to do. It's this orientation of our whole lives. Love God with our heart and our soul, our mind and our strength. Love God with everything that we've got. Love God with all that we are. It's the kind of love that we see in Abraham, who was willing to go to another country and was willing to offer his son as a potential sacrifice. It's the love that David had for God, and King David's heart burned with the zeal for God. You see that in his Psalms that he writes, Psalm 69, where he says that if someone insults God, that insult feels like an insult to him. And David says, take not thy Holy Spirit from me. And David says that your love is more important to me than life itself. David says, your commandments are sweeter than honey. They're like gold to me. It's the love that we see in the prophets who spoke the words that God gave them. It's the love that we see Ruth carrying with her, and Esther discovering this love that lets them stick their necks out for people they care for. It's the love that inspired Moses to leave a life of luxury and comforts and to lead God's people from slavery. And there's the law. There is the word. There's God's commandments, but the heart of all of that, the beating heart, is love. Without love, it's just empty words. Without love, it's just rules following. Without love, it's just noisy gongs and clanging cymbals. Without love, it's just the infinite, almighty, everlasting God. And who are we that he should be mindful of us? Jesus said that the most important thing that we can do is love God. And he said the second most important thing is that we love each other. And you know, what does it mean to love God anyway? Because love can seem kind of mushy. I mean, Valentine's Day is coming up, and we start talking about hearts and roses and chocolates and strawberries. So, what is Jesus saying exactly? He's obviously getting at something deeper than giving God a box of chocolates. Obviously, this is not about roses. So what does Jesus mean when he says that we're supposed to love God? And part of what Jesus is saying is that there is not any one thing that we do to love God. You can never check loving God off of your list. It's not this task. Love God. Been there, done that. It's not that something you can kind of say, well, I did that. Love God, check. Loving God is something that we grow into. Loving God is something that we are led into over the course of our lives as God's Spirit draws us ever more deeply to God's heart. It's not this one thing. Loving God is this whole life response to God. It's worship and offering. It's hearing the word and breaking bread at God's table. It's prayer and paying attention to him. It's giving our whole lives to God. And that's why the love of God makes sense of the law and the prophets, because the purpose of the law and the prophets is to orient us towards God. What Jesus is saying is that love is the hidden logic of the law and the prophets. Whatever you do, love God, and all the rest will fall into place. Loving God's a commandment. This isn't original to Jesus. It's the commandment that's found in Deuteronomy 6 as part of what is called the Shema, which is the Shema, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And it's a commandment because it's something that we're called to do, but it's not a limiting command. It's a command that opens up for us true and free human life. Love God. Now think about this with me. We are what we love. We are committed to what we love. So we will do whatever it takes to care for those that we will love. And love is this animating force. Love is loving the wrong thing, or loving the right things in the wrong way, is the source of so much trouble. I think it's often what leads us astray. And so part of what Jesus is saying is that we're going to love something. We're going to love someone. The question is who and what we will love. And I think so often we get ourselves in trouble not because we do the wrong things. It's not because we do the wrong things so much as we love the wrong things. So think about this. We love winning so much that we fudge the rules just a little bit. Or we love our candidate so much that we forget to care for our neighbors. Or we love our country so much that we forget God made all people everywhere in his image. Or we love our comfort or our safety or ourselves. And any of these loves can send us down a path away from the love of God. See, love orients us. Love gives us purpose. Love sets our lives on the right track or the wrong. And true freedom is the ability to truly love. Writer David Foster Wallace once said that the so-called real world of men and money and power hums merrily along in a pool of fear and anger and frustration and craving and worship of self. And I think what sets us free from this mess that he describes is the reorienting power of love. It's learning to love truly that allows us to live truly. It's learning to love God above all else that allows us to live safely and truly with money and power, because love grounds us. Love identifies us. It's learning to love and to love God that recenters us in what is authentic love. You know, this is why I think Jesus started in love. Because to truly love God is to be free to serve him, free to walk before him, free to cling to the good and reject the evil. If we love God, then the rest of our life will start to fall into place. And what I think is interesting is how in verse 40, Jesus says it's on love that all the law and the prophets hang, right? So it's those two commandments that are the center of it all. The law and the prophets hang on those commandments to love. The law and the prophets find their meaning in those two commandments. They're fulfilled in love. They hang on love. Because wherever you hang your love is going to be where you hang your life. Okay, and I told you about my grandpa's hat rack. We'd go in, we'd hang our hats. And we say, where do you hang your hat, right? Like it's this little saying in English that we have. Where do you hang your hat? And hanging your hat means a couple of things. It could be where you live. So where you hang your hat is where you make your home, or it could also mean what you depend on or what you believe in. It's kind of like this idea, the hat rack. So you could say, I hang my hat on the GPS knowing where it's going to go. And that may or not be a good bet to make, I don't know. Or I hang my hat, it's what I believe. So I hang my hat on the truth that every person's life is precious to God. So where we hang our hat is what we depend on. It's what we believe on. It's the place that we call home. So here's the question for us. Here's the question for you. Where do we hang our hats? Where do we place our belief and our trust? What do we depend on? And I think Jesus uses this word hang. It's a very interesting word to bring in here to talk about the commandment to love God and to love people. He brings in this word hang to talk about the law and the prophets. He says the law and the prophets hang on the love of God. The law and the prophets, they find their center and their meaning in the love of God. It's the love of God that gives the law and the prophets their force and their meaning. They hang on the love of God. And part of what Jesus is teaching is if that we want to understand him, we want to know the center of his teaching, then we have to look to the ways that his teaching and his life are rooted in love. Jesus' teaching always hangs on the love of God and neighbor. Jesus hangs his hat on love. Because there's lots of other options out there, lots of places we can hang our hat. Where do you hang your hat? There's lots of options. There's sports teams, there's jobs, there are families, and there's country. There's all of the hungers of the human heart, all of our longings and wounds that clamor for our attention. But none of these will do. None of these will give us a true life orientation. Where do you hang your hat? I think we have to learn to hang our hat on the love of God. Love God. And I think it's the love of God, it's that God saw when he looked at David's heart. And he saw that David made mistakes, and he saw that David sinned, and he saw that David wasn't this perfect individual, but at the same time that David had this profound longing for God above all else, that David's love hanged on the love of God. And I think it's the love of God that God saw in the heart of the Apostle Paul. And I think that's why God took hold of Saul and he turned him around and he gave him this new name and a new vocation. And you see this in Paul's letters. He wrote to the Corinthians and he said, the love of Christ urges us on. It's love for God that makes us stick our necks out there and risk it all for Jesus. And Paul revealed the source of his strength and the goal of his life when he told the Thessalonians, may the Lord direct your hearts to the love of God and to the steadfastness of Christ. His whole ministry and apostolic calling hung on the love of God. That's where Paul hung his hat. What about you? Where do you hang your hat? What do you believe in? What do you depend on? What shapes your life? What grounds you? Where do you hang your hat? Where has the love of God grown dull in your hearts? Where are we loving something else above God? Where are we finding our identity in something other than the love of God? And love of God puts us in touch with God's love. So the Apostle John, in his first letter, he says that God is love. He said that everyone who loves is born of God. He said that perfect love casts out all fear. I think that when we learn to love God, then we are led into God's deep love for us. Now, back in the 4th century, a guy named Augustine wrote this commentary. He wrote a sermon on 1 John chapter 4, that part where John says God is love. And Augustine interpreted this, and he said, you know what this means? He said, love God and do what you will. And I think what he was getting at is not that as long as we love God, then none of the rest matters. I think what he was getting at is that if we love God, that starts to impact everything else we're going to do. It starts to force us to reinterpret our decisions, to think about how we live our lives. Love God and do what you will. Start with the love of God, and the rest begins to trickle out from there. And I think Augustine's right. Love of God is our calling. Love of God is our identity. Love of God is what draws us away from false and flat loves and what breathes life into true loves. Love God and do what you will. Hang your hat on the love of God, and all the rest follows. Amen.